Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I have been asked to introduce the subject of the debt restructuring that Sri Lanka will be undertaking over the next few months. I believe that historians will look back on this time and conclude that Sri Lanka was the first major sovereign debt restructuring undertaken in the post-COVID era. It will be undertaken in an environment of global financial distress. Sovereign debt stocks around the world are at historically high levels. Interest rates are rising. The major central banks of the world are weaning themselves from their quantitative easing programs that have injected massive amounts of liquidity into the markets over the last few years. In addition, we see precipitous rises in commodity prices and shocks to the tourism industry. The principal challenge that Sri Lanka will face in conducting this debt restructuring in this difficult environment will be to coordinate the various creditor groups and to coordinate the individual creditors within those groups. There are 4 major creditor groups that will be involved here. First are the bondholders. Second, the traditional government creditors, so-called bilateral creditors. These are the OECD countries that since 1956 have renegotiated their loans to emerging market sovereign borrowers jointly under the auspices of the French Treasury, and that group of creditors is called the Paris Club. The largest Paris Club lender to Sri Lanka is Japan. Quite apart from traditional Paris Club lenders are non-Paris Club bilateral creditors, the largest of which is now China. But this group would include India, for example. And finally, there are the multilateral lenders, the IMF, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and so forth. The multilateral lenders, let's put aside for a moment. They enjoy nearly universal acceptance, preferred creditor status, meaning that their loans would not be subject to any debt treatment. They will, however, be expected to be net new lenders to Sri Lanka during the process. But the other 3, the bondholders, the Paris Club, and the non-Paris Club bilateral creditors, exist in a kind of Hobbesian state of nature, which is to say that any settlement of the debts owed to one of those groups that is preferential to the settlements with the others will probably proportionally disadvantage the others. So they view each other with a degree of suspicion. I suspect each of them secretly hopes that they can negotiate a preferential settlement of their exposure, but in public, each of them will embrace the principle of intercreditor equity, by which they mean that the terms of debt relief agreed by any one group ought to be comparable to that asked from the other groups, not necessarily in how it is implemented, but at least in a net present value effects on the debt stock. As I said a moment ago, the challenge will be how to coordinate those groups. In November of 2020, in the middle of the COVID pandemic, the G20 countries announced a new initiative. They called it the Common Framework. For the first time, the Common Framework contemplated that Paris Club bilateral creditors and non-Paris Club bilateral creditors, principally China, would sit at the same negotiating table and would renegotiate their claims against the poorest countries jointly. There were 73 countries eligible for the common framework. Sri Lanka is not one of them. Sri Lanka is not classified as a low-income country for this purpose. That said, I cannot see any policy reason why a common framework approach to the bilateral debt stock might not be possible here. By that I mean to create an ad hoc joint bilateral creditors committee in which the traditional Paris Club creditors would sit, as well as China and India and any other non-Paris Club bilateral creditors. You will ask, how quickly can all of this be done? The answer will turn to a very large extent on the IMF's assessment of what is needed to return Sri Lanka to a sustainable debt position. The IMF is working on that assessment now, and until we see it, it will be difficult to predict the timing of this for obvious reasons. The deeper the debt relief that the sovereign must request from its creditors, the longer it typically takes to persuade those creditors that that is something that they should participate in. On the bondholder side, there is some good news. Sri Lanka has borrowed its international bonds using a trust structure, and that will centralize enforcement in a trustee for any bond that has not matured, and those bonds have collective action clauses. In summary, there are significant challenges facing the Sri Lankan government, but there is every reason to believe that this operation can be conducted in a satisfactory way to return Sri Lanka to a sustainable debt position. The government has identified very able and experienced advisors, and everyone involved in the process is perfectly aware of the need to alleviate the hardships that the Sri Lankan citizens are currently facing.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Based on your wide experience, what are the do's and don'ts for Sri Lanka in this exercise?
A principal do is what is being called transparency, which is to say that each of these creditor groups, if they're being asked to give debt relief, have a right to know the terms of the loans of the other creditor groups and the treatment that they'll be given to them. The challenge here, Dinesh, is that China has in the past shown a predilection for bespoke sovereign debt restructurings, and they have been reluctant to release the terms of those settlements. That only fuels what I described a moment ago as the suspicion of other creditor groups. This will be a principal do for the Sri Lankan authorities. On the don't side, the mistake I have seen governments make most often is to try to turn the external debt restructuring into domestic political advantage. So one demonizes the foreign creditors and tries to extract a political advantage. That, frankly, is all atmospherics and rarely helps.
Professor Lee, how should the pain of the restructuring be shared?
I would like to say equally. This, Dinesh, is going to be one of the things that the IMF must assess. All sovereign debt restructurings in the end come down to a simple burden sharing decision. How much of the pain of the economic adjustment is to be borne by the citizens in the form of what the economists call fiscal adjustment. You and I would call it increased taxes and reduced pensions and so forth. And how much is to be borne by the creditors in the form of debt relief. And that is not simply an arithmetic decision. It must take into account social, political, frankly, at the margin, even moral issues as to how much burden can be placed upon the citizens in this. But the safest approach, Dinesh, would be to say that among the creditor groups, a comparable contribution will be sought from each.
Professor, in your view, what type of debt sustainability plan would fly with China and the IMF?
Well, the IMF is the organization that in the first instance will do the so-called debt sustainability analysis. They will try to determine what package of fiscal adjustment and debt relief would return Sri Lanka in a reasonable period of time to a position in which it has a sustainable debt profile and can re-access the private capital markets. That's not really my area of expertise, so I won't speculate about what it might look like. But everyone will be looking to the IMF for that basic assessment. Once they give it, then the debt restructurers can begin their work to implement a program that will achieve those objectives on the debt relief side.
Okay. Any specific advice to the president and prime minister and the politicians involved in this exercise?
My advice would be stay the course. Every country at this stage of the process is looking down a pretty dark tunnel, but countries do get through them. And if a debt restructuring can be handled in a professional way, its temporal scope will be limited, and the damage that it will inflict on the country's economy, on its credit reputation, and on its citizens can be minimized. Look, Dinesh, all sovereign debt restructurings are always and everywhere painful. I won't sugarcoat that for you. It is not a pleasant undertaking, but it can be gotten through. And on the other side, the country can return to a position of normalcy, and that is the objective. So I would tell the government, don't give up hope. It is a difficult and disagreeable process, but there is light on the other side.
Thank you. And my final question to you is, why does the media call you the fairy godmother to finance ministers in distress?
I never thought that phrase, fairy godmother, quite sent the message that I wanted to say. No, I have done this work for 40 years in more than 24 countries. I have retired from the practice of law, but I now try to help wherever I can on a pro bono basis to use what experience and knowledge I have garnered over those 4 decades to help. So I think my fairy godmother status might be explained by that.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Lee. It was great talking to you, and look forward to engaging with you in the future as well.
Indeed. Good to see you.
Thank you.